I'm Phoebe Merrick, and I got involved in the Warhorse project partly because I'm secretary of the Friends of the Romsey War Memorial Park, and partly because Dorothy Baverstock, the councillor who initiated the project, knew that I was involved in the history of the Warhorse and had been giving talks on it. I've been on the committee, so I've been to nearly every committee meeting since the beginning. I've been the historical consultant, but I've not done much on fundraising. At the beginning of the First World War, the War Department, in particular the Remount service, set up a training camp for horses for service at the front. And this camp was set up on the outskirts of Romsey. And during the war, they probably trained about 140,000 horses and mules. After the war, the camp was demolished, and the demolition rubble was used as hardcore to raise the ground to form the War Memorial Park, so that all that remains of the Remount depot is under the grass in the park. And we wanted to commemorate the horses who had served in the war specifically. After the war, the park was founded. We had no park before that, and a war memorial put in it, and General Jack Seeley came to unveil the war memorial. He was by then Lord Mottistone, but it was his horse Warrior that was the inspiration for the Warhorse book, film and play. At the beginning of the war, the army had 3 camps that it owned and managed. It also had horses in other camps where it outhoused them, and it decided that it needed a training camp for horses for the First World War. So it rented land on the Broadlands estate to the southwest of Romsey on Paunceford Hill, where they could build a camp that would be dedicated to training horses, up to 5,000 horses at any one time, and with a complement of just over 2,000 men. There was also a veterinary hospital up there. The horses came to Romsey, many of them from North America, particularly the United States. Most of those from the United States came via Devonport, and then they were collected by the men from Romsey camp, put on trains and brought to Romsey. We don't know exactly where they were offloaded. I think probably in the Great Bridge area, because the station platforms aren't wide enough to unload several hundred horses onto at any one time. Then the horses would have been brought through the town, down Middlebridge Street and up Paunceford Hill to the camp. This must have been a fearful nuisance to Romsey, having several hundred semi-wild animals brought through the town at intervals. But there was a war on, they put up with it. When they got up the hill to the camp, they were taken to a series of paddocks known as the kraal, where the horses were given a minimum of a fortnight, usually longer, in which they could get over the stress of their journeys. Once they had done that, they were then allocated to one of the 10 squadrons in the camp, where they were groomed and shod, dipped against infection, and then taken into training. I don't know how long the training lasted. I've seen no figures for that. When the horses were deemed to be trained, most of them were sent to the front. Originally they were sent to Swaithling, which was the dispatch camp for the whole of England, but subsequently they were sent direct to the docks at Southampton and loaded onto ships there, and then the officer in charge just took the figures up to Swaithling so that there was a proper record being kept. And again, the men whose horses were being shipped off to France, they went in procession down to the docks. Each man rode one horse and led a second one. On the edge of Southampton they rested the horses and then rode to attention through the city. When they got to the docks As was the case, every time there was a major movement of animals, they were checked by a vet, and any that were found to be in foal, unwell, or with a temperature above 101 were put on one side, with the result that the army managed to avoid much in the way of epidemics because they were so careful with the horses. Now, going back to the camp, as I said, you have 10 squadrons, each of which has just over 200 officers and men in it, and they would look after up to 500 horses each. And this would be the total care of the horses, starting at 5:30 in the morning with the first feed, up to 6 feet more feeds during the day, the last one being about 9:30 at night when the horses were given hay to see them overnight. Each man had care of up to 3 horses, which meant feeding them, grooming them, exercising them, and mucking them out. So quite a lot to do. There was a certain amount of spare time. And these were fit young men, so there was quite a lot of competitive sport organised in the camp, squadron against squadron, partly to improve the esprit de corps and partly to keep the men occupied. When they exercised the horses, sometimes they did specific military training in the camp, sometimes they simply rode them round the lanes nearby. Now, many of the nearby lanes were rather narrow, and there was a school quite near the camp at Ridge, and it was so dangerous for the children trying to come to school with all these horses in the lanes that the school lost half its intake. The children went to Copythorne instead because it wasn't safe for them to come along the lanes to school. We don't know anything really about the non-commissioned officers or men. We do have lists of names of the officers and vets who were attached to the camp. We know that men came and went, officers came and went. Some stayed for a long time, but others were here for just a few months. The most outstanding people who were here was Colonel Jessel, who subsequently became Sir Herbert Jessel, and then after the war, Lord Jessel, who was commandant for most of the war. And the other man who was here for the whole time, right up to 1920, was the distinguished equine artist Lionel Edwards. And he was elderly by army standards when he joined up. He was 36, but he was horse mad, you might say, and his pictures are very well known by all the people who like pictures of horses. He went on to be quite distinguished between the wars and right up till his death in about 1960. He was a captain, and he not infrequently had to lead parties down to Devonport to collect horses, or if there was a group of horses that were unsuitable and were cast, he would take them to sale rings to be sold. And after the war, he did a lot of overseeing the sales of the horses that were still left in the camp. 2 interesting disposals of horses that weren't to France. They sold 6 horses to a canal company. These would have been heavy horses, of course, because canals were still part of the network of transport for Britain. And they also, more inexplicably, sent 60 horses to a prisoner of war camp in Sussex. And I can't think what was going on there that needed 60 horses. The men, of course, lived in huts in normal army camp fashion. What was new in the Romsey camp was that the stables and the men were close together, so each squadron had its billets for the men and its stables for the horses more or less co-located, which was found to be very convenient in terms of administration. The men, of course, were fed in the normal army fashion 4 meals a day, and what is interesting is that during the war a number of them moved up from one health band to a higher health band. This is probably because they were being fed properly, whereas one of the problems at the outbreak of the war was that so many of the working class were ill-fed and showed signs of undernourishment.